Welcome to our next webinar on our financial charitable giving series. I'm Michael Horn, Vice President here at Final Frontiers.
My name is Danny Nelms, President of Final Frontiers.
And I am Scott Vigneri, and here to help you understand charitable giving.
All right, Scott. So I think today we're talking about the taxes, I believe.
One of everybody's favorite subjects, taxes.
Comes up every year, surprisingly.
Right. And actually, I do find it fascinating, especially from this aspect. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Tom Wheelwright, but he is Robert Kiyosaki's, I guess, tax specialist. His CPA is on his group, and he says, "I love taxes. It's exciting to me."
Takes all kinds.
Yes.
But yeah, and he's an interesting guy. I would recommend his books. So, all right.
All right, Scott. Well, we'll let you take it away.
All right.
You want the screen slideshow started?
Yes. Sorry.
Right.
I thought you were reading my mind, Michael.
Not that good, so sorry.
Well, it's quick reading, not a whole lot there.
Yeah.
So, as many of you know, if you've been on these before, I start, and I will continue for I don't know how long until I decide otherwise, but I always start with this slide here with this young lady. And I always think of God created this young lady. And I say this every time, nearly. And as I say every time, God knows her fears. God knows her concerns. We don't know what she goes through, but God does. And God loves her. And God gave Jesus on the cross to die for her as much as us. And that's what this is really all about, helping to learn how we can be more effective in our giving to help the gospel get out to not only people like this, but you'll see in a minute, I have a picture from Ukraine and people like that. The whole world needs the gospel. And so we're going to talk about taxes, and you're going to say, what does taxes have to do with missions? In fact, as I said in the article, in a word, everything. And so I'm going to give you a little history of taxes, and we're going to talk about that. And then we'll move on from this webinar into more details about how some of the concepts that we'll cover can help with taxes. All right, so let's move on to our next slide. Now, this is one of the pictures I was talking about. This is in Ukraine. These people need to hear the gospel. And these people here are helping them get needed supplies. I think we're around 600 days, very nearly 600 days of continuous war in Ukraine. And, you know, many of these people are just trying to live day to day. They don't have political agendas. They just want to survive and raise their own families. And yet they're in a war-torn country. And so we can get the gospel to these people. And my wife and I pray every day that God would supply their needs and give them the resources they need, and for other areas as well. But there's a need right here in Ukraine, obviously, and there's many other parts of the world. But back to taxes. Taxes have been around for a long time in one form or another. And, you know, if we look in the Bible, we can see that Matthew was a tax collector, and I believe that publicans is another word. Publican is another term for a tax collector. Not usually one of the most popular people in society, and usually very wealthy because there was no real accounting. As long as they got the Romans what they wanted, they didn't care. The Romans did not care what the publicans took over and above that. And so they often took way more than what was required. And so it's been around for a long time, but our current system in the United States had its official beginning, our Treasury Department and the Internal Revenue Service, back in 1913. And when we started, the highest tax rate at that time was 7%. Would that help you, Michael? 7%?
That would.
And how about you?
Oh, yeah.
Most
Sure.
of us are usually around the 20s. And only 1% of the population was required to pay it. Now, within a few years, the highest rate went from 7% to 77. I guess they were trying to be like the Bible, 70 times 70 or something like that. But they kind of missed the mark. So 77%, that's a big bite. And more people had to pay a higher rate. So let's move to the next one. Harding and Coolidge. The Harding and Coolidge administrations instituted reduced regulations, and they reduced taxes after World War I. And their objective was to stimulate economic growth. And interestingly enough, this era became known as the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties is recognized as one of the most prosperous eras of our nation has known. Now, my dad was born in 1926 or 29. He's been gone for some time. He would be 80. No, he'd be 90 some years old. And obviously being born in the 20s, he wouldn't have remembered much of it. But it was recognized as one of the most prosperous eras of our nation at that time. The standard of living was raised for everybody. Unemployment all but disappeared. And in contrast, we have the Great Depression following. It was a totally different story. Unemployment all but disappeared. More people could afford a house. And the highest income rate, tax rate dropped to 24%. Remember, we were at 77%. Now we're down to 24%. Not 7%, but 24%. But that was a little more manageable. But in addition to that, not only did the citizens and the people prosper, but the government prospered as well in revenues. So we reduced taxes, we reduced regulation, but the government prospered as well as everybody else. The government made more revenue and was able to give more services and more defense spending and infrastructure, bridges and dams and stuff like that, roads and so on and so forth. This was way before our superhighways began. That was not until what, early 50s when they started building the superhighways, the interstates. And I think that was under Eisenhower for the most part. And again, we called that the Roaring Twenties. So, okay, next slide. Smoot-Hawley. I've never heard of this, to be honest with you. I got to minimize this. Have you ever heard of that, Daniel, Michael, the Smoot-Hawley Act?
Definitely not me. I'm not American history.
Oh, that's right. You grew up in England, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I was never a history person to begin with, so it's definitely outside my wheelhouse.
Yeah, history usually made me sleep. So
Yes.
I did very well in World War II history for some reason, but anyhow, Herbert Hoover became the president in 1929. Now, prior to becoming president, he advocated strongly for an agricultural tariff because he wanted to protect American farmers. And that sounds good, and you really can't fault that. But in the meantime, lobbyists work to broaden the scope of the bill. And it involved other industries as well, steel and manufacturing and so on and so forth. So it became the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. The problem is people knew this was coming, and so in anticipation of this legislation, the stock market began to collapse in 1929. And we know all about, the stock market collapse. We've learned about that. But as the situation continued to decline, government revenues declined as well. So being a good government, they tried to raise the income tax. Then they raised the corporate tax. Then they raised the death tax. And then they added the gift tax to try to raise government revenue. And this really didn't raise the revenue. All it did was lead to a longer downfall and prolong the Great Depression. And many of us are familiar with the Great Depression through history. That's one thing we had to cover in school. And you may, your grandparents may still be around and you've learned from them what it was like. I remember, excuse me, I remember my hang on. We can't talk today for some reason. I remember my grandmother, I'd go to her house and she would save every single bag from the store. And she had them behind her, by her refrigerator. It was just solid bags up and down. She had boxes of pencils that she saved. And those would be sometimes our Christmas presents, little boxes of used pencils.
Thanks,
And-
Grandma.
And we weren't terribly excited about them. We'd look at each other and go, ah. And rubber bands, oh my. A drawer full of rubber bands. And you know how they get old and kind of, they lose their stretch and they get kind of gummy.
Yes.
A lot of those. But she was around during the Great Depression, and it had such an impact on her that the rest of her life, she was very careful about everything. And she saved coupons. And yeah, we go to her house and she'd be clipping coupons. Many of those people have passed away, but there are still a few here and there. We don't have that experience for the most part of going through a Great Depression like they did. But as time went on, the taxes went up, unemployment went up, and the economy just kept declining and declining. And we endured the Great Depression. So let's move on to the next slide. This one surprised me. And did either of you hear of the Bank Holiday Act of 1933?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Good man. And that's an interesting, some marketing people must have got a hold of this one because they call it the Bank Holiday Act. And you think, oh, that's where Christmas clubs started. No, that's not. Or, something of that nature. That's not at all what it was about. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in 1933. Hoover had raised the taxes, but then when President Roosevelt took over, he did not do anything to reduce any of the taxes and did not diminish any of the regulations when he took office. But what he did do was he signed the Bank Holiday Act into law. And this is very interesting to me. The Bank Holiday Act, number one, prohibited banks from buying or selling silver or gold. A bank could not sell it or buy it. It prohibited banks from providing foreign exchange. So if you had been to Canada and you went to the bank to exchange it, they wouldn't do it because they weren't allowed to. Or if you had been in Mexico and you came back with some Mexican money and you went to your bank to exchange it, they wouldn't do it because it was now illegal. Any contract that had been written negated was with gold involved in it. Those were all negated. No grandfathering. If it had a gold clause in it, it was negated. Now to that, a gold clause in a contract is kind of, unfamiliar to many of us. But back in those days, that was a part of many contracts. Instead of money, they would use gold in some cases, some form of gold. And then it required all Americans to sell all their gold to the US Treasury. But not only did they have to sell it to the US Treasury, all of it, it was at a 60% devaluation.
Wow.
They were getting $20 for it, And that was what, $20 and some odd cents is what they were being paid for their gold. And they devalued gold down to $35. So they were even getting less. They reduced the value of gold, and then they were even getting less than what it was worth. And it had become a criminal act to own gold. And despite all this, the economy continued to decline, and unemployment had risen above 25%. 1 out of every 4 people was out of a job, and many people were hurting, and the Great Depression was still going on. And the government continued to raise taxes. The highest rate reached, that is not a typo, the highest rate reached 94% by the end of World War II. Could you imagine paying a 94% tax rate? You'd work all year and you'd get what? 2 weeks worth of your pay to
Use
keep?
$4 on your 100
Yes,
or $6.
That's-
Sorry. It's crazy.
that's incredible. And but in the meantime, the government continued to raise taxes. The highest rate reached 94% by the end of World War II. And the economy continued to decline during the war. And so the standard of living continued to decline during the war, and incomes continued to decline during the war. Now, many people came back from the war and things turned around for a lot of people. We have the housing boom and the baby boom, and that all happened. But during this time, it was very, very bad for a lot of people. And all our men were off to war, and many times, especially in factories that were manufacturing airplanes and tanks and ammunition and other equipment, many of them were women, the wives of the men over there were in the war, or sisters of brothers in the war, and they had to work there. But still, it was declining. And then we were running short on resources as well. In my opinion, God intervened and turned things around for us. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide. And because we're limited by time, this actually could be, a book just talking about all this. And many of the notes I've got here have come from books and courses. But as we continue to move forward in history, what we will see is the incredible impact that taxes and regulations can have on the economy. And in one way, that's kind of a duh, of course. But on the other hand, I don't think we realize the full impact. It's more than just the economy buying and selling, and it's more than just producing goods. Taxes and regulations have a huge impact. And it can be good or it can be bad. And we've seen up to this point that when taxes are raised, the economies can often falter. And when they are reduced, they can often lead to prosperity. And it's not necessarily motivated by politics. We have certain presidents that were Republican that reduced taxes, and the economies under them flourished. Many people love Reagan because of what he did with the economy. And what a lot of people don't realize is that President Clinton, who was a Democrat, made a lot of very smart moves. He was smart enough that he separated the economy from the politics. And too many times the economics becomes a political weapon. And we're seeing that more and more too. Be it good or bad, we can see that when taxes are raised, economies often falter. And when they are reduced, they can often lead to prosperity. But obviously, there has to be some form of taxes. Otherwise, there'd be no roads, there'd be no armies, no navies, no Marines, no Air Force. My daughter would be out of a job. She's in the Air Force. And by the way, she's being moved to Korea next in March. So it is finding that balance. That's the trick, that what they call the point of elasticity. And taxes can be viewed by many as manipulative or as incentives. So let's move on to the next slide. So Michael or Daniel, do you guys have any questions or anything that you'd like interject at this point? Questions
No,
come in yet?
not really.
I certainly don't envy people having to deal with tax policy because, as you said, it's a very multiple variables.
Yes.
Tweak here can cause a big change there, and definitely a difficult thing to maintain.
And you know,
Typical
economics has been often called the dismal science. And if you talk to some economists, you can see why. But not all of them are like that. But then there's two different schools, two prevailing schools. One is what they call supply side economics. The other side is what's called Keynesian or Keynesian economics. And they have different approaches to everything. And so that's also, that affects how people look at taxes and how they can use them. And that's a factor in, you know, who is legislating and setting up our tax rules and our tax laws. So taxes as an incentive. Basically, there's two types of incentives. There's the carrot, the positive incentives that promote certain behaviors. And yes, the tax system is utilized by our government to promote certain behaviors. There's also negative incentives that serve to prevent certain behaviors. The easy one that comes to mind is taxes on tobacco. They try to discourage people from cigarette smoking. And so they raise the taxes on stuff like that. And in some states or some areas, you pay higher for alcohol because of taxes. Positive incentives, we're going to get to that in a little bit. So there's basically three reasons that the government institutes taxes. As we said, one is to change people's behavior. Another is to raise revenue. And then another has become to redistribute income. And redistribution is often characterized as the Robin Hood effect. Now, there was a day where that was not really an issue, but it is becoming more and more of an issue as time goes on. And it is an underlying factor in the reason that many governments are raising taxes. They raise the rates on the wealthy and reduce the rates on the not so wealthy. But it actually does not work that way because there's too many other factors involved. And so they are trying to motivate us one way or the other, either not to do things or to do certain things. So let's move on to the next one. So what a lot of people don't realize is that, yes, the IRS is your default charity. You are giving your money to the IRS, and they have become your charity. And what they are doing is taking your money and they are using it as they please. And they are directing it to go where they want it to go, as in the government and the Treasury Department. You have no control over that money once you pay that. And you do have to pay it. So we should all pay our taxes, but is it wise? Is it prudent to pay more than is necessary? What would you say, Daniel?
I think that's a personal question. Often when I've itemized my taxes, I've actually paid more than I could get away with withholding or keeping for myself, because I like having smooth roads to ride on and a military that protects me so that I can sleep at night. And I want to reduce the risk of being audited. And if I take every tax advantage I can, that increases my risk of being audited. Not that I wouldn't come out of it fine, but that's a headache I don't want to deal with. So I think that's probably a personal question, but by and large, no, I wouldn't say you want to pay more than you have to.
And you're right. And being a financial guy, I didn't consider it personal, so I apologize for that. But but that also underscores the fact that everybody's different. And so you have different goals, you have different things that you want to accomplish. But the IRS has codes and laws that allow us to do certain things where we can reduce the amount of taxes that we could pay under IRS code. And so if we do nothing, the IRS is our default charity, and the Treasury Department decides where the money goes, not us. Now, some positive incentives the IRS offers are certain aspects of real estate. Why would they offer those in real estate? Because they want to get people to help other people with housing. If I buy an apartment building and they give me tax incentives, I can write off my costs or certain things that I can write off. I can keep my rents lower. And there are many things that governments do to help keep the rents low. And so that's an incentive to help other people with their housing. Charitable planning. They want other people to help other people. Children, educational grants, and so on and so forth. They want us to help those kind of people. So they're willing to make concessions and give us certain provisions that allow us to use charitable planning and gifting. And life insurance. There's tax codes around life insurance. Life insurance has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think I mentioned one of the companies that I worked with turned down Napoleon Bonaparte for insurance. And I think they made a smart move. But on the other hand, maybe Napoleon Bonaparte knew something and I better check. Maybe his wife said, how's your life insurance? I can't remember what company it was. New York Life, I think. How's your life insurance or something like that? They had that old ad. So isn't it wise and prudent? And to your point, Mike, Daniel, according to what you want to accomplish, to take advantage of the incentives in the tax code, and then use it to further advance the gospel. And that's what this is all about, learning how to take advantage of some of these tax benefits and then use it to benefit and get the gospel out more. So on to the next slide. So I want to thank you for stopping in. And we're going to look into more detail on life insurance and the tax benefits that come from life insurance. I know that there are many, many people that think life insurance should not be used as an investment. And I'm not saying that. We're not suggesting using life insurance as an investment, but life insurance can go way beyond just the death benefit. There's many things that it can be used for. And like I mentioned before, why are so many and more wealthy people utilizing life insurance? I have a couple I'm going to be meeting with after this meeting. And they have a large, I have to be very careful how much I say, obviously. Hey, you were talking about us. But I'm going to be meeting with them, and they have a very large amount in stocks and bonds. They're terrified about the market volatility and inflation. And they also have a large amount of land. And they came to me first about life insurance. They want to look at life insurance. I'm not selling them life insurance. They came to me. Why are all these wealthier people asking about life insurance? Because there's power on it that many people are not aware of. I got another doctor that has come to me, and we'll be talking about the same thing, using life insurance as a tool in her overall estate. And people are purchasing huge policies, 10 million, and I think I mentioned this in an article, $20 and $50 million policies. We have some people that have multiple policies that add up to over $100 million. Why are they doing this? Do they know something we don't? And I
Probably.
said that last. And are they that stupid? If they're that stupid, how did they make that much money? And if they're not that stupid, then why are they doing that? Is there something we don't know? And in many cases, yes, there is something we don't know. And is it a secret? No, it is not a secret. It is in the tax code, and we can use it just like anybody else. And so I wanted to help us understand taxes, and the taxes are used as an incentive. And it behooves us to take advantage of those certain incentives that will help the gospel and help us personally. And so moving forward, that's what we want to look at, is how to take advantage of some of these benefits that the tax code gives us and use those to help the gospel get out. And yes, we do need to pay our taxes. As, like we said, we need smooth roads, and we need, my daughter's in the Air Force and she needs to get paid. We need an Air Force, and we need an Army, and we need police, and we need fire department, and we have a Coast Guard. I live by Lake Michigan. I see the Coast Guard a lot, and we need the Coast Guard. We need all those. So yes, taxes are a part. But if they have allowed things in the tax code that will help us reduce our taxes and give us more control over where some of our money goes, I think we should at least look into it. So anybody got any questions?
Seems
Very
pretty
good.
straightforward to me.
It's great to kind of see, I guess, get a visualization that paying taxes, you do have the option to potentially work things in a way where, well, you can direct not necessarily all the funds you have to the IRS. You can direct some of them to charitable donations,
Right.
totally legally, and actually get a purpose completed or help out a purpose where otherwise you have no control.
Right. And, we're not advocating in any way, shape, or form, shady things. And you work with a CPA if you've got a CPA, or some kind of tax advisor, depending on
A
your
good
situation.
CPA is a vital thing to have. I've found in life, even when I first started working and barely made $100 a week. I got a CPA the first time I needed to file my taxes, and because I had lived part-time overseas and part-time here, and he got me back well more than I had paid in withholding. Granted, it wasn't much, but I've used those same people for years. I'm not going to say who it is because that's not the purpose of the webinar, but I was just telling my daughter the other day, because she's getting ready to get a first job and everything, and I told her, get a CPA, get a good one. I said the guy I use is a wizard. He knows exactly how everything needs to be done, and it's really
keep you out of trouble.
Costs money, but he'll make sure that you don't count something you shouldn't, or you count something that you should.
Right.
And yeah, it's a vital part if you live in the United States, at least. I can't
work with an
recommend it enough.
organization. Exactly right. I work with an organization, you're like this, Michael, that one of the guys I work with, he's from Bristol, England.
Okay.
He was a chartered accountant, which is the equivalent in England of a CPA. And another guy named Paul, who had an accounting firm over there, and he sold it for a good number. And now he's over here. He started another company that he has a knack for growing his companies and doing very well. He's one of our partners in our company, not in my company, but in the network that I'm part of. But exactly, a CPA, I mean, the value of a CPA cannot be overstated. So, all right.
So I think that is it. I think you said next month we'll probably be, you'll be doing one on taxes and life insurance.
Yes, we're going to go into a little deeper into how a policy actually works.
That should be really interesting. I've always been curious about that.
Okay, well, good.
I've heard about people doing it, but I couldn't wrap my head around it.
Well, and that's what we're going to do, is how are these wealthy people, what are they doing? why are they doing this? And we're going to look at in some of the mechanics. And it doesn't necessarily have to be super wealthy, but it'll help us understand why these people are doing this. And then they're using some other things beyond that that can help. But so yeah. And that's
anybody who's watching today, we do have an archive of the previous webinars. So if you've missed any, you can go to our YouTube channel and view them there. Just click on the playlist. You'll find one called Charitable Giving webinars, and you can catch up on everything there. And all Scott's articles are over on our missions website, missions.world. Just scroll down, you'll see the first one there, and then you can follow on to the others. They're all linked together in a charitable giving series. I think with that, anything else before we head off?
Nope, I'm good. If you guys can hang on for a minute, if you want to go ahead and close out the webinar.
All right. Well, thank you everybody
Thank
for
you.
joining, and we'll see you next month. We'll send out an email once we have it scheduled, and we'll see you then. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for stopping by, guys.
Thank you.